you're never going to encounter Satan, probably never going to encounter Satan face to face personally. Do you know why? You're not that important. Now, I'm not insulting you, it's just true. He can only be in one place at a time. Jesus encountered him. Why wouldn't he? He was the Son of God. You're not likely to. He can only be in one place at a time, and I know where he is right now. He's in the Kremlin. So I know exactly where he is, and I'm not kidding about that.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So this morning I'm launching into a little mini-series, a two-parter called The Unseen War. Some of you maybe saw some of this on the Exchange last week, and I'm going to kind of expand on that a little bit. And you know, people have war on their minds right now, don't they? I mean, I don't know anybody that's not thinking about war. For one thing, we just went through a 2-year war against COVID, and now we have war in Europe like we haven't seen for almost 70 years since the last World War. And so what I want to talk about today is the war behind the war. We spend a lot of time watching the news, watching these things play out, and we often forget about the fact that there's a spiritual war that has been brewing for 2,000 years behind the scenes, and even longer before that. We'll talk about that in a moment. There's this great story I love, I tell sometimes, about this Baptist church. They were having a service one Sunday morning, and the back door of the church opens, and who should walk in but Satan himself? And there he is. He's got, horns on top and a pitchfork and a pointy tail and sulfur, the smell of sulfur. He walked in the back doors, and everybody headed to the exit, and the pastor was the first one out. He went out the window. And there was only one man, an old farmer, sitting there in a pew chawing on a piece of straw. And the devil went right up to him and said, "Why are you not afraid of me?" To which he pulled out the straw and said, "Why would I be afraid of you? We're kin. I've been married to your sister for 35 years. Just in case you're wondering, that's not a true story. That's made up. I always have to explain that because sometimes people don't get it. So here we are. We're in a very familiar passage. It's Ephesians chapter 6, one of the most famous about this subject. Starting at verse 10, it says this: "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Well, there's a lot going on in this passage, right? It tells us who our enemy is. It tells us who our enemy isn't, and it tells us what our weapons are. Now, I'm not going to get into this today, but if you keep on reading this, it actually goes through the armor of God. It tells us that we should stand against the enemy by putting on the whole armor of God. And I've done a whole message on this, so I'm not going to repeat it. You can go back and watch it. You'll remember it was in Lessons of Lockdown. It was called "The Armor is Awesome," and it was fun for me because I dressed Steve up in the Roman armor. Do you remember that? And I beat him with a stick. Do you have that picture of that? We have that picture of that. Now, that's the devil coming up. Steve did pretty good, Pastor Steve, against the devil. But he didn't do so well against me. I was hitting him for that stick, and he's whining like a little girl. And but when we think about this, we recognize that God says, Paul here uses this metaphor of the Roman armor to defeat the enemy. And I think one of the things we've missed is that he didn't change metaphors when he talked about who our enemy is. Principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, and spiritual hosts of wickedness. And so he hasn't changed, topics. The metaphor is still the same. And so I want to take a moment, and I want to show you the Roman hierarchy and the demonic hierarchy and how Paul was actually talking about the same thing. So I'm going to throw it up on the screen, this little diagram. What we have, if we look at the Roman hierarchy, for example, you have Caesar. He was the empire, or the emperor of the empire. And then you had King Herod, who ruled over Judah. And then you had Pontius Pilate, who was the governor in Jerusalem. And then you had the Roman legate, which was equivalent to a general today. And they were the military overseers, the military leaders over these armies. And then, of course, you had the Roman legions. You had the actual foot soldiers. So that's a little bit of a picture of the Roman construct, political and military construct. And then if you go, you realize Paul's actually talking about the same thing when he talks about this. And so let's go back to it for a moment. We have the top there. We have Satan who rules over this whole thing. We have the principalities. Then we have the powers. Then we have the rulers. And then we have these spiritual hosts of wickedness. And so here's what you need to know there, that Satan is not omnipresent. He can only be in one place at a time. And so he's going to need delegates. For example, you're never going to encounter Satan, probably never going to encounter Satan face to face personally. Do you know why? You're not that important. Now, I'm not insulting you, it's just true. He can only be in one place at a time. Jesus encountered him. Why wouldn't he? He was the Son of God. You're not likely to. He can only be in one place at a time, and I know where he is right now. He's in the Kremlin. So I know exactly where he is, and I'm not kidding about that. And so he has these various delegates, and the first thing we find out is about the principalities. And here's how I interpret this. As you go to various nations of the world, you recognize that there is a spiritual presence and a spiritual atmosphere over pretty much every country of the world. And we learn this a little bit from Daniel chapter 10. We find Daniel, he's in prayer, he's been praying for 21 days, and finally the angel of the Lord shows up and says, I came from the very first moment you prayed, but I have been withheld by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Do you think a literal, natural prince could stand a spiritual being, Gabriel, whoever this angel was? No, so what's he talking about? He has to be talking about a spiritual prince or a spiritual principality. And he calls them the prince of the kingdom of Persia, which today is Iran. And then he says, but Michael came and fought, and he called him your angel. Michael, your angel, came and helped me, and I have now come. And so we see that there was this spiritual war going on. Daniel was praying. He didn't actually see it. The angel explained it to him. And so we have this principality or this prince, spiritual presence. And as you travel the world, and I've been fortunate to be in a lot of places, you find these things. You walk into these countries. You go to South Asia. You go to Southeast Asia. It's pretty hard to escape the spirit of idolatry in those places. And I'm not trying to be insulting here, but in India, they have 350 million idols. And it's extraordinary, and you can't escape it when you go. When you go to Eastern Europe, you can actually feel the presence of political oppression. Even in countries that are now liberated, you still feel it. It hangs like a pall. You go to the Middle East, where the prince of the kingdom of Persia hangs out, and I'll tell you what you sense there. You sense the presence of military conflict. And everywhere in the world you go, it's this crazy thing. You feel the atmosphere changing. And then you have the principalities, then you have the powers, and which is sometimes translated authorities. Just like every region or city has an authority. Pontius Pilate was the governor in Jerusalem, and he kind of ruled the day. There's a spiritual presence in every city. You go to New York, you go to San Francisco, you go to Paris, you go to London, you feel a presence there. We were on a tour once in New York City. We're going down the streets of Manhattan in a bus tour. And the bus tour operator shocked me when he said this. He said, don't think for a minute that when this city was founded by the Dutch, they came here seeking religious liberty. They came here to make money. And I thought, he knows a lot about this, because it's a beautiful city. How many of you have been in New York? But you can't escape the power of money and greed that exists in a place like that. And everywhere you go in the world, you sense that presence, some sort of spiritual presence that's a little bit hard to quantify. And then I think you have the rulers of darkness. And you look into any city, like Winnipeg's no different. There are areas where there is darkness, or there's rulers of darkness. There's spiritual climates in different parts of the city. You can go where there's drugs, and you can go where there's prostitution, and you can go where there's crimes. I know there's areas in this city, am I right, that you don't like to go? How many of you know what I'm talking about? You know, Tuxedo, places like that. And then finally, here's where most of us live. Spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places, meaning they're in the unseen realm. And there are demons in this realm, and they live and breathe, or whatever they do, and they exist, and every single one of you have encountered demons. I promise you. Some of you are encountering one right now. No, I'm just kidding. But we've all encountered demons, and it's basically how it works. And so this is the snapshot that I wanted to paint for you, because we're in this battle, and there's an unseen battle, and he says that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in the Lord for pulling down these strongholds. So what I want to do is I want to take another minute, and I want to look at the war in Ukraine, and I want to use it as a metaphor. And don't think for a minute I'm trivializing what's going on there. I know it's terrible, it's horrific, it's an atrocity, it's a crime against humanity, it's dreadful, so don't misunderstand any of that. But I do think it's a helpful picture for us to understand how spiritual combat and conflict works. So I just want to throw up this first picture this is pre-1991, when the USSR was still intact, and you had Russia ruling over all of these countries, Poland and Romania and Hungary, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and it had this incredible, powerful reach. And you see, sort of right smack in the middle of that, you see this country, Ukraine. And most of you know this history, and then in 1991, the Iron Curtain fell, and all these countries became liberated to some degree or another. And then if you look at the map today, and this is the NATO map, and it's kind of helpful, all those countries in the blue are all now NATO countries. They're all countries that have joined the Western Alliance and are standing against. You've got Russia, the Great Bear to the east there, and then you've got these NATO countries in Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and then you have Ukraine, right smack in the middle between these two forces. And it's not a NATO country, and there's a reason why. Some of you won't like this, but they've only been a democracy for 30 years. And the NATO countries don't believe they're stable enough democracy yet, and that's why they haven't given them membership to NATO. They've never been a democracy. For 1,200 years, the Ukrainian people have lived in this location, and they have been the subject of being pulled back and forth between the East and the West. And you go read their history, it's fascinating, it's super complicated, and Russia was a force on one side, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the other side, and they tugged and pulled at this. And then in 1793, Catherine the Great, the Tsar of Russia, she took control of Ukraine and controlled it for 200 years. And then in 1991, they finally became this country. And for the first time, a democracy, a republic, a free country that is struggling with its identity, but it's still stuck and caught in this tension. It's interesting, the word Ukraine means borderlands. And that's why for many years, it was always referred to as the Ukraine, the borderlands, just like we call Holland the Netherlands. And of course, after they got their liberation, their sovereignty, they said, we don't want to be called the Ukraine. We are a country. We want to be called Ukraine. And here's the picture I'm trying to paint for you for a moment, is that we as people on planet Earth are a little bit like Ukraine, in that we are caught between two forces. And I don't want to overstate this. It's just a metaphor. Understand this. But if we look at the map again, if you can just show that up one more time. So you have Russia to the east, which for my intents and purposes today is representative of the kingdom of darkness. And it is Satan in his realm and in his power. And the NATO countries on the west, just for sake of illustration, I'm not telling you that they're that great, because they get lots of problems of their own. But they're representative in this metaphor of the kingdom of heaven. And what you have is you have Ukraine stuck in this dynamic tension between heaven and earth. And see, that's exactly what happened on earth here. You need to understand this, that when man was put on the earth, guess who was already here? Satan was already here. He showed up in the garden on day one. He was already here because he had been cast down to the earth. And then because Adam and Eve fell to him, because they obeyed him, the whole world came under the rule of the kingdom of darkness. And it's absolutely true. It says, for this reason, the Son of God was manifest to destroy the works of the enemy. And this is what it says about him. It calls him the God of this world. It calls him the prince of the power of the air. Jesus himself calls Satan the God of this world. And so for 4,000 years plus, the world was under control of Satan and his kingdom spiritually. And then Jesus comes along and he dies on that cross. And when he did and he cried out, "It is finished," and we assumed, well, he liberated us. He defeated the enemy. Not entirely. It doesn't say he banished him. How many of you, if you were God, you would have drop-kicked him right off the planet? How many? That's what I would have done, but nobody asked me, right? And they didn't ask you either. And for whatever reason, and maybe we'll know when we get to heaven, but he left him here. But this is what it says. He disarmed principalities and powers. He's still here, but he's been disarmed. And if he goes about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, I'll tell you something, he's gumming you to death because he's had his teeth pulled. You're following this, right? And so we are caught in this difficult place where for the last 2,000 years we're still doing battle. Now I have a lot of things to tell you about this. It's going to take me the 2 weeks to do it, and so I'm only going to get through a couple today. But here's my points on this. Here's the spiritual battle. Number one, don't forget who your real enemy is. Number two, don't underestimate your adversary. Number three, don't make any deals with the devil. You're going to like that one. And number four, don't expect God to fight your battles for you. So the first one is, don't forget who your real enemy is. It's interesting how Paul starts this off. He says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And what he's telling us is that people are not our enemy. How easily do we forget that? You know, this is not an observation. He's not saying, well, you wrestle not against flesh and blood. I've watched you. You're not wrestling against flesh and blood. Are you kidding me? You're terrible at this. We're all terrible at this. It's instructional. He's saying, look, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. Hello? You're following this, right? He's instructing us, and yet we get so caught up in this. We get so trapped in this whole thing where we begin to fight with one another. And you've heard this before, that the greatest trick that the enemy has ever pulled on mankind is to convince them that he doesn't exist. See, why is that such a big trick? Because if Satan doesn't exist, then who's your enemy? People become your enemy, right? And so that's his greatest trick. I actually like the way Conan O'Brien put it. How many of you know who Conan O'Brien, late night guy? Here's what he said. It was in a tweet. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The worst trick he pulled was that got your nose thing. I love that trick. Why does he think that's the worst trick? I do it with my grandkids all the time. Got your nose, got your nose. They don't know I don't have their nose. That's my thumb. That's not really their nose. It's a great trick. I don't know what Conan's thinking. But it is a great trick that the devil has pulled on us because he gets us fighting one another. And I think if the last 2 years proved anything, it proved how easily we can get suckered in to fighting one another. Would you agree with that? I mean, look at the last 2 years, the pandemic 2 years I'm talking about here. We had people fighting politically, racially, families were divided, churches were divided, friends were divided. What were we thinking? Well, frankly, we weren't thinking, and we forgot who our true enemy was, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Can I tell you something that's absolutely true, and you probably don't want to hear this from your pastor, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So I've been in ministry almost 40 years, and the last 2 years, I encountered more criticism in 2 years than all the years before that in ministry, in 2 years. Every time I opened my mouth, I had somebody mad at me about something. And I thought, I can't win. It's a good thing I'm such a knucklehead, right? And I just keep on going. But I'm telling you, thick skin's not going to get you through this. You can have all the thick skin in the world, but at the end of the day, that's not going to be enough to allow you to deal with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Thick skin is not one of the spiritual weapons. And we have got to figure out how to deal with this. I couldn't even believe some of the criticism I was getting. I'm going to tell you this one story because you'll appreciate it. So I did a message a few months ago, you'll remember. It was all about not being offended and forgiving everybody all the time, kind of one of my core themes. And I had this woman phone me, and she was so offended with me in a message about not being offended because I used the word crotch in a sermon. I used the word crotch. Not only did I use the word crotch in a sermon, I said the word crotch behind the sacred pulpit. You know, as long as I'm standing behind this thing, it's not very sacred. And I didn't know that crotch was somehow a word you shouldn't say. If I knew crotch, I shouldn't say crotch. I wouldn't be saying crotch if I didn't know I was supposed to say crotch. I don't need to, it's not like I have to use the word crotch. I can't use the word crotch in every single sentence. Well, actually, I can. But anyway, so I thought, I'm going to need a new strategy. How am I going to deal with this? So I tried something I'd never done before, and I'm recommending this to you. It's a spiritual weapon we never talk about. I've never done it before. It starts with H. What was it again? Oh, humility. 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 I'm almost spitting it out. And here's what the scripture says. It says, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And the very next verse says, resist the devil and he will flee. We always forget that humility is actually a spiritual weapon. And if you humble yourself, it's amazing that the enemy has no place in you. And so I decided, how am I going to deal with this? Every single day I was getting hammered by people, and a lot of them people I loved, frankly. And I thought, well, how am I going to deal with this? I thought, you know what? I'm just going to take a humble attitude and a humble perspective on this. And that's how I'm going to deal with this. And it was hard for me because I'm combative by nature. You probably know that. I'm a little bit, a little bit of one of those guys that likes to duke it out. That's all I can say. So anyway, I'll give you just one example of this. So I had a pastor friend, been friends of his for years. And I said something in a meeting that offended him and made him so mad, and he was just done with me and whatever. And I thought, how am I going to deal with this? And I decided I was going to humble myself, so I phoned him up, and I said, you know what? I think you were right. And he went, what? You think I was right? I said, maybe you were right. And you say, Pastor Mark, did you really think he was right? Well, not exactly. But here's the point. Maybe he was right. I mean, who knew? In all that stuff we were in and all the misinformation and disinformation coming from every side, I am not putting my relationship on the skids for who is right. What was more important, to be right or to maintain that relationship? A relationship's all more. I've been this guy's friend for years and years. I said, you know what, you might be right. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that I was admitting that he was possibly right. I didn't go right out and say he was right. You know what Jesus said? He said, agree with your adversary quickly while you were on your way with him. And he's not talking about your spiritual adversary. He's talking about your earthly adversary. Why would he say that? Because a lot of times, relationship is not worth the conflict. And here's the thing I've been telling people for over a year now. It's okay to have a position on all of these things. It's okay to have a strong position. But it's not okay for you to divide yourself against your brothers and your friends and your sisters and your neighbors. It's not worth it and it's not right. And one of the other things, I'll just add this too before I jump off of this. One of the other things I did that I'm not good at either is it starts with an A. What's it? Apologize. That's it. Thank you. How many of you have done more apologizing in the last few years than ever in your life? Am I by myself on this? Like there's 6 of us. You should try it. It's really awesome, actually. So the first thing is this, real important, is that don't forget who your real enemy is. And the second thing, we're going to land with this today, is don't underestimate your adversary. You know, when we look at the devil, he is a brutal creature, ruthless. When you look at Putin, I mean, it's sort of shocking how ruthless he is. He's bombing civilians, he's bombing children, he's bombing hospitals, he's bombing daycares, he's killing women and children as well as soldiers. And you think, why is he so ruthless? Because the enemy is ruthless. And that's what's motivating this man. And you go read the book of Job. We don't love the book of Job particularly, but here's what Job was. Job was open season, the devil having open season on Job. You go read the story. That's what it was. And we find out what he did. And this is what the devil did to him. Not only did he strike him with painful boils, but he destroyed his house, he destroyed his barns, he destroyed all his crops, he killed all of his servants, and he killed all 10 of his children. And the only thing he left him with was his, 3 grumpy friends and his cantankerous wife. And, I think he figured probably better off to leave them alive, because that'd be more of a punishment. Am I reading that wrong? I think I pretty much got it. And see, here's what the enemy does, is that he will always lie to us. That's how he gets into us. And you know what? I think one of the things we do by not recognizing his lies, we underestimate him. When Putin was all around Ukraine on every side, why were people thinking he wasn't going in? He had amassed his armies all around Ukraine. And he said, oh, I'm not going in. I'm not invading Ukraine. Why do you think I'm invading Ukraine? I'm not going to. Oh, okay. That's good. Well, I'm glad he's not invading Ukraine. Well, the devil is a liar and the father of lies, the scripture says. He's always lying. And here's how the lies of the enemy work. He tells you just enough truth to get you to believe the lie he's always telling you. I'm going to say that again. He tells you just enough truth to get you to believe the lie he is always telling you. All you have to do is look at the very first lie. Adam and Eve, they're in the garden. The devil comes up to them. They underestimated him, first of all. He comes up to them and says, are you not to eat of the fruit in the tree? And Eve doesn't even know what's going on. And she says, well, we're not even supposed to touch it. And he says, God knows that you will not surely die, but you will be like him, knowing both good and evil. Was any part of that statement true? Was it? What part of it? That you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. That part of it was true. The lie that was buried in that was the fact that you will surely not die. That was a lie. But what the devil does is he comes to us and he buries it in enough truth that he tricks us into buying into the lie. And that's typically how he works. You look at Putin, and he's done it again and again and again. He has enough truth in it to get you to believe the lie that he's been telling all the way along here. So I'm just going to tell you, it's a little dumb story, but I'm going to tell you anyway. And we'll wrap it up with this. So I was coming down this aisle right here before the service started one day, and this woman that I'd recognized, but I didn't really know who she was, she stepped out in front of me, and she said, Pastor Mark, why do you hate me so much? And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't hate you. I don't even know who you are. But I didn't say that. And I thought, what? And she says, why do you hate me so much? So I said, well, why do you think I hate you? She says, because every week you walk down this aisle and you never say hi to me. She says, I'll make eye contact with you and you will never say hi to me. You ignore me because you hate me. And I'm thinking, well, that's a bit of an assumption. And really, you know, I'm walking over here, I'm focused, I got this message thing kind of rattling around in my head. You don't think I just make this up as I go along, do you? I actually have to think about this stuff that comes out of my mouth. It may not be that good, but at least I've thought about it. And so I'm walking down this aisle. I'm not thinking about who's on my left or right. And so the devil, I want you to see how the devil worked in her mind. It was true that I was ignoring her, but then she jumped to the conclusion and bought into the lie that I hated her, which is absolutely not true. And you see, this is where we do battle with the enemy, because he will always come and sow. It's the little lies. It's the little foxes that spoil the vine. It's the fly in the ointment. And that's what he does. He plants these little lies and these little seeds in you, and he gets that assumption going in your heart. And that's why one of the greatest weapons of our warfare that we have is the truth of the Scripture. What was the very first weapon in the armor of God was gird your loins with truth. And you see, Jesus said, if you abide in my word and my word abides in you, then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. You say, how can the truth of the gospel set you free from something like that? I'm telling you, I don't know how it works, but it works. You see, when we grab a hold of the truth of God's word, it protects our heart. It girds us and it protects us. And when the enemy comes in with those little lies, we don't believe them because our lives are rooted in his truth. We have this enemy. This enemy is a vicious enemy. The scripture says that he has come but to kill, to steal, and to destroy. But the verse goes on and says, but I have come that you might have life and life more abundantly. Jesus is on our side. The 2/3 of the angels are on our side. I have read the end of the book, people, and we win the war. Greater is he who is in you than he that is in the world. And if God be for you, who can be against? Let's stand together.
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.